This is an interview with Paul Morland, a demographer based in the UK who writes and speaks about how population trends shape history, economics, and the future. In this conversation, he explains why fertility decline, aging society, migration pressures, and cultural preferences may be some of the defining forces of the 21st century. You can read more about Paul Morland on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degreesaway.
What single demography concept best explains the 21st century, and what's the biggest public misconception about it?
The history of the last couple of hundred years has been driven by, at least the demographic history, has been driven by economic change. As people have got more industrialized, more urban, wealthier, more educated, they've gone through what's called the demographic transition, which means, first of all, you have high fertility. You start in conditions of high fertility, high mortality, and low population. And then first the mortality falls, you get better food, you get better healthcare. This is a crude but general explanation. And while the mortality falls, the fertility stays high, so the population grows. And then eventually, as people become more educated and urban and wealthy, the fertility rate falls too. And so eventually you go from high fertility, high mortality, low population to low fertility, low mortality, high population. There are some parts of the world that is still going through this process. But this is essentially, for most of the world, a 20th century process that was more or less completed by the start of the 21st century. So in most places, by the start of the 21st century, mortality rates were low, life expectancy was long, fertility rates had fallen. So really, people are still in that mindset. And to answer your question, what I think has changed and what I think is distinctively 21st century is the idea that instead of economics now, as in the past, shaping demography, where you were in that economic progress determined your demography. Now demography is shaped by culture, by preferences. People live long, but how many children are they going to have? Are they going to have 2/3 or 3/4 of a child on average like South Korea? Or are they going to have 3 children on average like Israel? Both highly mobile societies, highly urban societies, highly educated societies. Their demography is no longer being driven by economics, but by culture. And now that economics is driving that demography is driving economics. Countries with too few young people coming through into the workplace. So in a nutshell, what's changed in the 21st century, and what I don't think people understood, instead of demography, population trends being driven by economics, we're now increasingly in a world where economics is driven by demography.
And how does this concept interact with non-demographic shocks? So like AI and geopolitics, is the effect multiplicative?
Well, I think the question is what then drives demography? If demography is no longer being constrained by economics, what is driving demography? And the answer to that is a whole bunch of things, including, yes, geostrategic shocks, but I think the essential point is what I've called culture. What I've said is culture, which is a very amorphous term and needs a lot of unpacking. But essentially it means, what are people's religious beliefs? What are people's politics? What are people's aspirations? What are people's ideology? That's the real driver now of population trends, rather than whether people are rich or poor, urban or rural, educated or illiterate. So I think the new kid on the block, effectively, in what's shaping population is culture, and that's a big term and means many different things, but essentially it contrasts with the material economic conditions which shaped demography in the past.
Okay. What are the top 3 causal drivers of fertility declines? So costs, culture, constraints. Rank them and cite the strongest evidence.
Well, I mean, that's citing. I'm not going to sort of give you footnotes in my talk, but what are the 3 strongest drivers of fertility depends on whether you're still in the 20th century so there's still part of the world that has not completed that demographic transition. And for those countries, the key drivers are the 3 kind of main correlates of falling fertility in the modern era, in the 20th century, in the demographic transition, which are urbanization, education, and GDP per capita. So if you went back to the 1970s, say, when fewer countries had passed through this process, and you asked me to forecast what the fertility rate was of a country based on three pieces of information, I would say, tell me that country's GDP per capita, tell me that country's level of literacy. Now I'd probably say level of tertiary education, what percentage go to university, but some measure of education and some measure of urbanization. And from those three pieces of data, in the modern 20th century, as opposed to the postmodern culturally driven world we live in now, those three things would have been very good correlates. And I've done some of this social science myself, some of the stats, and just the GDP alone data in 1970 gives you a very good view. There's a strong correlation, gives you a good idea of a country's fertility rate. And if you've got the urbanization and the education data, so much the better. So obviously, the richer, the more educated, the more urban, the lower fertility rate. Now, if you take a postmodern country, a country that's essentially passed through this process, which, as I say, is increasingly more and more countries, what determines fertility of the country or within the country? I would say the two most important things are politics and religion. So there's a very high, in most countries, obviously it varies depending on the religiosity and which religion we're talking about. Buddhism, for example, Hinduism seem to have very little correlation in India and in the Buddhist world with higher fertility. But out in what we could call the Abrahamic world, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic worlds, the more religious you are, the higher your fertility. And then politically, and the data actually in the US is probably the best for this. In the US, the more right-wing you are, the more Trumpian you are, if you like. If you just look at how people voted, there's good data on by county for voting for Trump and Biden. I haven't seen it for Kamala Harris and Trump, but anyway, if you go back to the previous election in America, there's quite a close correlation by county, and I suspect by individual, on what their political leanings are and how many children they have. With the more right wing, the more Trumpian, the more MAGA, if you like, having the higher fertility rates. And that kind of correlates, I suppose, with the third thing, which is, and that's true again in America, very much so in the US, less so in Europe. The more, still the old thing, the more rural, the higher the fertility rate. So that one continues. So, you won't be surprised to learn that the fertility rate in South Dakota is much higher than in Manhattan. And you can argue whether that's because people living in big cities can't afford to have the accommodation for many children, or whether people living in big cities choose to live in big cities because they're not very child focused.
How much
I'm just going to say very briefly why that's the case, I think, in the US and less so in Europe. If you take a country like America, it's so big that somewhere like South Dakota has got a culture that is genuinely a rural culture. Whereas if you come to Britain, whilst there are obviously urban areas and rural areas, you're never very far from a big city. So that you don't have the kind of backwards, the sense of places that are really very geographically disconnected from major urban centres. And that's true of other European countries too.
How much of fertility is policy responsive versus preference driven? And what's the most convincing causal study either way?
I think it's a false dichotomy, because you are setting up a world of two things. There's policy and there's preference. But preference doesn't exist in a vacuum from policy. So one of the things I'm increasingly thinking about, writing about and talking about is how preferences are shaped by politics. And there are two very good examples of this from the UK, and one probably applies to the US and one doesn't. In the 1960s, the UK legalized homosexuality and banned the death penalty, which obviously hasn't happened in the US. And both measures were very much against public opinion in the 1960s. The law as a teacher, as it were, the law, the politics ahead of the preferences. But the policy, part of what policy can do is shape preferences. So I don't want to draw a very distinct line between the two, and it may be something we come on to later, which is what exactly can politicians do, what can policy do, and to what extent should that focus on changing people's preferences as some sense of how many children they want, as opposed, say, to the simple economic calculus or tax calculus or benefits calculus or welfare calculus they face when they make decisions about having children.
Point to a country that has credibly lifted births in the last 2 decades. What mechanism, not just spending, moved TFR?
Well, some of the Central Asian countries, I think Mongolia, which isn't strictly Central Asia, but it's not geographically that far, and Uzbekistan would be good examples. And in both cases, the politicians have embraced high fertility, they've preached high fertility, and they have made it, they have tried to, and I think succeeded in making it. Something that people want to have. So people want large families in those countries. And whilst their fertility rates have not gone way off the chart, they're still kind of perhaps 2.5, 3. They are both, Uzbekistan and Mongolia would be good examples of countries where there is a strong and clear political leadership which understands the issue and is sending signals. I mean, for example, they give medals to women with a certain number of children. Now, that policy might not work in other countries. The key is not precisely what they've done. The fact that they've recognized the issue, they have promoted motherhood, fatherhood, marriage, or coupling up anyway. In those societies, most births are within marriage. So they've promoted that, and it seems to have been effective. I mean, you could never absolutely in social science say A has caused B. Philosophically, perhaps you can't say it at all. It takes us back to Hume. But anyway, essentially, that's what they've done, and it seems to have had an effect, as against the fertility rate in other former Soviet countries, which has continued to fall very steeply.
And in these countries where TFR has been going up a lot, were there unintended effects that you know about? Maybe marriage age, migration, employment?
Not particularly there. I mean, there is an interesting case in Hungary. So the Hungarian government has tried very hard to get the fertility rate up. And it has succeeded to some extent. It's slipped back a little bit, but it's still way, way below replacement. But one thing that's very interesting in Hungary is all their policies, which seem to have been focused on pro-natalism, have, whilst they've only modestly improved the fertility rate, have had a very strong effect on marriage. So people can have different views on this, but it would seem that changing the marriage rate is relatively doable, and that can be done through fiscal stimuli and so on. Now, once you've got more people marrying, can that convert into a higher fertility rate? That's a little bit more difficult to engineer.
Can immigration sustainably offset aging once second-generation fertility convergence is accounted for? What integration metrics matter most?
Well, immigration can't do it successfully for a number of, sustainably, to use your word, better word, for a number of reasons. One, you've hinted at, that fertility rates fall towards the host population. Latina women in America, in the US, for example, have had among the fastest falls in fertility rates. And there are two things going on there. One is they live in city centres and they're largely urban, no, not entirely, and they adopt the low fertility of the host population. The second is actually, if you look at the fertility rate in South America, Central America, and particularly in Mexico, it's fallen very low. So look at the difference in fertility rate between the US and Mexico back when mass Mexican emigration started in the early 70s, and look at it now. It might have been, Mexican women might have had 4 or 5 more children than American women back in 1970. And today, the fertility rates, probably if you look at the very best Mexican data, the fertility rates are not very different, maybe a quarter child more. So the countries from which immigrants are coming are already low fertility countries in many cases. In Britain, we've had a tradition of immigration from Ireland and Poland, both now very low fertility countries. Even India is going below replacement fertility. And then, of course, even if they do come from high fertility countries, their fertility converges. So that's 2 reasons, I suppose, why immigration is not sustainable. The third is that in order to keep the support ratios level, you have to have bigger and bigger immigrations. Of course, the migrants grow old. They don't have large families. So what you become, instead of being a country, you become a kind of land strip in which you're trying to drag in more and more people. to compensate for the growing number of elderly. Well, that can't be a global solution to too few children. What it will mean is that there will be some competition for immigrants, and the immigrants will increasingly come from the relatively few remaining high fertility countries, which are countries with very low human capital now, the ones left. So they are more culturally and religiously distant from us. They are lower human capital. It'll be harder to make them economically successful. It will be, and it'll be harder to integrate them. And I suppose there are two other reasons why immigration is not a sustainable solution. One is people don't want massive ethnic change, and they vote accordingly. And we saw that, if you really want to understand the vote for Trump, the vote for Brexit, the rise of the Front National in France, whatever they call themselves these days, the AfD in Germany, Meloni in Italy, it's all about immigration politics. So it's become a big political issue, and there is a reaction against it. The final thing is it's not right that countries that are wealthy and successful say we're too busy to have our own children and train them up, say, to be doctors. So we will leave countries like Ghana to go through all the pressure and burden. I believe it's a pleasure as well, but we're not going to have the children. We're going to pay for the schooling. We're not going to train them up all the way to being doctors, and then we'll just whip them up from the third world when we want them. Ghana, a country we get a lot of health workers from in the UK, needs health workers. So it's also iniquitous. So for a whole range of reasons, it is what we've relied on to compensate for aging populations and declining workforces relative to the retired population, but it is not sustainable.
In your opinion, which metrics best predict long-run fiscal net effects? So, employment rates, wage convergence, language proficiency, and intermarriage.
For integration?
Yeah.
I don't really have a view on that. I mean, I'm not in the business of saying, number one, I believe in integration. Number two, these are the best metrics to measure it, and number three, here are the policies to foster it. These are matters I'm extremely interested in, but I don't think I've got any particular expertise.
Okay. What's the most misleading dependency ratio chart in public debate, and what metric should replace it to gauge fiscal pressure?
Well, I don't think there is a dependency ratio chart in the public domain. It's not something I see very often. I talk about it a lot, but I think it would be much better. Let me put the question another way. If I talk about the problem with dependency ratios, people tend to focus back on the total population. So it's the total population numbers that are the most misleading. And the example I always give, and here, if I had one chart to put in the public domain, this is the one I would put. It's the example of Japan, simply because Japan's had a very low fertility rate for a very long time. So people say, well, in the 1960s, Japan had 100 million people. And then the population grew, and now it's declining. And when we get back to about 2040 or 2050, it will be back to 100 million. What's the big deal? There'll still be 100 million people in Japan. And what they're missing precisely is the dependency ratio chart, which shows that in 1960, when it reached 100 million people, Japan had a ratio of 7 or 8 people aged 20 to 65, call it working age, to every retiree. When it gets back down to 100 million on the way down, instead of having 6 or 7 to 1, it will have barely 1 to 1. And I think that's the problem is not the dependency ratios in the public domain, but the gross population data, which doesn't reflect the age structure, which is you have 100 million Japanese in 1960, 100 million Japanese in 2050, and it's a totally different proposition in terms of the sustainability of the society and the relationship of the population to economics.
If you ran a finance ministry, which lever has the best ROI against aging? Later retirement, immigration, or automation/AI? And how do you quantify it?
Well, I haven't done the work, so I can't tell you the answer to that. I mean, people have done studies. I don't think there's anything very definitive. But I think this is where I will come back to something that I spoke to you about earlier, which is preferences and policy, as you put it. I think that's a good dichotomy, albeit a false one. If you pay money to people to have children, if you give tax benefits or welfare, etc., that's all very good. but very expensive. The advantage of changing people's preferences, in principle, if we can do it, it could be much cheaper. So let me give you one example from the UK, and everything I know about the US suggests it's the same there. You could actually change the sex education in schools from one which essentially still tells people how not to get pregnant, which teenage pregnancy has fallen off a cliff in most developed countries, including Britain, in the last 20 or 30 years. So we're kind of fighting the old one. It's not that I want a load of school kids to get pregnant, don't misunderstand me. I think it's better to leave it having children until you are in your 20s at some point. But you're much closer to this than I am, but even my children are long out of school. But the focus of education is very much on prevention of sexual diseases and pregnancy. How about explaining to people how they do get pregnant when their fertility trails off? That may be more of an issue for women. For men to understand that whilst their fertility trails off much more slowly, the possibility of getting a partner who is of fertile years also declines. And therefore, we need to think about modelling our lives in a different way and not just shunting childbearing and family formation at the end of a bunch of other things we want to do in the face of our changing biology. The reason I think the ROI on that's going to be very high is because it doesn't cost anything. In fact, it could cost nothing at all if you simply devote the budgets on sexual and reproductive health today to be teaching a different curriculum.
If you had $1 to spend, which lever gives the biggest fiscal gain by year 5 and why?
So I'm not answering your 5.
Okay.
I'm not exactly following the structure of your sentence. So I would say in terms of policy, in terms of persuasion, I'd put the dollar on changing the sexual health and reproduction curriculum in schools, right? And if in terms purely of fiscal policy, I think the best thing is to give tax cuts to people with kids. Higher taxes for those without kids, lower taxes for those with them. And the reason I think that is if you simply give, I'm not saying I'm against child benefits as a welfare measure, but if you simply give a fixed amount, that fixed amount will mean more to some people than to others. Whereas if you give tax relief, wherever people are on the earning spectrum, that will potentially have a meaningful impact on them. Whereas a flat amount of money to a lot of, say, well-educated, high-earning women won't mean very much to them. So you want to spread the incentive across the population. Giving tax breaks rather than welfare checks or child benefit checks is a better use of funds.
UN versus IHME, population projections. Where do you disagree, and which assumption drives the gap?
Well, I'm not really in the business of critiquing the micro work that people do in putting together the data. The only thing I would point out, the UN has some very sharp critics on the fact that they have been rather slow to reduce their global forecasts. An awful lot of peak population. It's come down from peaking in 2100, sort of somewhere around 12 billion. Now probably it's going to be south of 10 billion. The big question then is really how quickly fertility rates are falling in sub-Saharan Africa. And the data is not very good. The places with very high fertility today tend to be and therefore where there's the biggest difference can be made, tend to be the places where fertility rates are the high fertility, places where the data gathering is not particularly good, because they're the poorer parts of the world. But it's not only sub-Saharan Africa. Across the world, fertility rates are falling off a cliff, and the UN has been rather slow at picking that up, and is perhaps rather optimistic from a pro-natal point of view about it recovering. But I'm not in the weeds, and I think the UN does a fantastic job in producing this data. Some critique of it is absolutely right, but I think it's people who've got an on-the-ground sense, particularly of what's happening to fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa, who are best positioned to do that critique.
What single piece of new evidence would most quickly change your mind about persistent low fertility?
Well, I suppose a turnaround in the fertility rate of the the world. It's not just the developed world anymore. If I started seeing, particularly a younger age, so I think what's really happening now is that Generation Z or Z are people born after 1997. Say, I've got three children, and the youngest was born in 98. The other two are slightly older, but they, for whatever reason, the boundary is drawn there, and it seems like Generation Z, who every year are becoming a larger cohort of the fertile, right? They're heading for 30 now. So very soon, everyone under 30 is going to be Generation Z, and then it will be everyone under 35. So before very long, the vast majority of one's fertile years will be in the Generation Z cohort. And their fertility rate appears to be extremely low. Now, what could be the case, I fear is not the case, is that they're just on mass delaying, and that when they get to 30, they're suddenly all going to start popping out kids. So that, I think, looking at it on a generational basis, because we know there's been a huge fall off in the fertility of the young and a big increase in the fertility of the 40 somethings. But the fundamental problem is that the fertility of the 40 somethings is really low. So even if it doubles, it hardly compensates for a small drop off in the fertility of those under 35. So I'd want to see Generation Z, as they reach 30, actually starting to have larger families, and I'm skeptical that that's going to happen.
So is there a specific study or data set that would make you believe that there is a real shift going on, that something's actually changing? And yeah, so not just the timing.
There are very good, in terms of data sets, there are very good analysts to actually are freelancing analysts who publish their work on X. I'd have a look at Daniel Hess's More Births, for example. And they look at very contemporary data, and they will give you much more up to date. So they will be the first to pick up, for example, Chile. Take a country like Chile, which you think, oh, South America, it's Catholic, it must be, it's relatively poor, it's not very poor, it's a middle income country, it must have a high fertility rate. Well, it's much lower than the US is. Or Puerto Rico is much lower than the mainland state. So if I started to see a turnaround in that data set, that would be the first indication that something was happening. It's all going the wrong way at the moment.
So when looking at countries' trends, you wouldn't look at a country like US or Britain first for an early sign. You would look at
Well, you never know where the first sign is going to come. But if I think the US and the UK are, particularly the US, somewhat, definitely the US, at the high end of the developed world. And we know the developed world is just moving downwards. So a turnaround there would be interesting. But it's the developing countries, the poor countries, the middle income countries that have super low fertility rate, which is falling off a cliff. What I'm looking for is that to start turning around. That's more likely to be a quick and dramatic change. US and UK fertility is dropping more slowly, although it is now really quite low.
if you had $10 million for one data project to improve demographic forecasting, what would you build and why?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, building makes it sound like I can give you a very detailed response on the kind of study I would do. But there's no doubt that that would be, if your question is what's happening to globe, that I mean, it depends what you wanted the answer to. But if you wanted the answer to the big demographic question, which is when will global population peak and where, then I would devote it to some of the highest fertility and lowest income countries in Central and West Africa, countries like Chad, countries like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. These are the countries where I think the marginal dollar of research will have the biggest impact on understanding when the global population will peak and where.
So I have a last question for you, which we ask all of our interviewees, and it's how do you define success personally and professionally?
Personally, personally, at the age of 60, I have four grandchildren, three happily married children, and four grandchildren. So that, and I hope to have half as between. I hope I'll have half as many grandchildren again, at least, and maybe twice as many. So since I spend my time preaching the need to have children, not ridiculously large numbers, we're in a modern world, both men and women wish to work, then my personal satisfaction is to have had a family in my late 20s, early 30s, and to see them thriving professionally themselves and combining that, both my daughters and my son, both my sons-in-law and my daughter-in-law, to see them combining, difficult though it is, and to help them in combining successful professional lives with building their own families. And professionally, what's my goal? The greater extent to which people in the world, I'm really the UK because that's where I'm based, but I do travel, I do go out to other countries. The more people are aware of demography, how it works, how it's affected history, how it's going to affect the future, what the current state of demography is in the world, the more people understand that, understand its importance, get the basics of it, and inject a thinking about it into their general perspective of the world, and included in that, understand the importance for the younger members of the community of having their own families. I mean, that is my professional mission at this stage. So that's what I would be judged on.